Handplates, released. Part 2. It took only a few days for Alphys and Gaster to outline the procedure and acquire the supplies needed. The most difficult item to obtain had been the anesthetic. Monsters didn't need much in the way of medicine, as most injuries and illnesses could be healed with a bit of magic and food. A few tonics had been developed over the years, to help with pain or injuries that needed more time to heal. With the right dosage, a monster could even be rendered completely unconscious for more invasive surgeries, without putting them at risk of falling down. Due to the rarity and potency of such chemicals, only the top physicians in the underground had the authority to synthesize and administer the drugs. Dr. Gaster not only had this authority as royal scientist, but he had also personally seen to the invention of most of them. The morning of the procedure, Alphys and Asgore had breakfast with the children to explain how it was going to work and what they needed to do. They had done this in part to settle their nerves, and in part to minimize the amount of speaking Gaster would have to do. The steps were simple enough to explain. They'd take the drug, fall asleep, and then Alphys and Gaster would set about to removing each of the screws. When that was done, they'd fill the holes left behind with a resin to reinforce the bones. It would set to be solid and strong, but remain semi-flexible so it would give and stretch a little as they continued to grow. Around midday, Asgore let Gaster into the clinic. He was once again without his lab coat. It seemed he was just going to have to accept that it would no longer be a part of his wardrobe when they were around. Together, he and Alphys had transformed the makeshift clinic into a makeshift operating room. There was a gurney wheeled into the center of the room, surrounded by curtains, bright lights, and several trays of medical instruments. There were also a few electronic monitors on stands, which Alphys was already busy calibrating. The children were perched on the top of the gurney, a bundle of oversized garments holding hands. Two waved at him in an attempt at hospitality that almost hid his apprehension. One was glowering as though Gaster planned on walking over there and eating them. As before, not an unexpected reaction. Asgore walked over to them and set a great paw on Two's back, jarring the brothers.
"Well, young men, are you ready?"
he asked, probably a little too cheerfully given the circumstances. One looked a bit peeved, but Two just smiled and bounced in his seat. "Yes, Your Majesty, I'm so excited!" The king's smile became warm and true.
"And you, Sans?"
The irritation dropped from one's face immediately. He shrugged and casually said, ready as I'll ever be." Asgore seemed satisfied with that answer and waved Gaster forward. He didn't acknowledge the children, instead approaching Dr. Alphys. There were already a few small wires running from the monitors to one of the bundles on the table. He stopped right beside her, and when she turned to face him, he signed,
"Is there something I can help with?"
"No, it's fine. I just got it calibrated to his soul." She glanced at the two on the gurney, then back at him. But you could look over it if you like. Make sure it's all, working correctly." Gaster nodded and looked over all the connections and readings, knowing they would be fine. Meanwhile, Alphys spoke to the brothers, asking trivial questions meant more for easing the tension than surgery prep. Asgore joined in as well, saying something that made them all laugh. When Gaster felt enough time had been wasted, he turned back to face them.
"Dr. Alphys, everything looks good. I'm ready to begin when you are."
All right, very good," Alphys stammered. "Papyrus, are you ready?" The child pulled his brother a little closer to him, then nodded. "We don't have to do this today, if you don't want. This is completely up to you." "I'm ready, Dr. Alphys." He looked directly at Gaster. "I trust you." Gaster felt a twinge sneak up his spine. He covered the motion by rolling up his sleeves, internally kicking himself. Had he lost his edge so quickly? How was he going to do this properly if he couldn't focus? Well, at least Two would be unconscious when the time came. Alphys bent down to a cooler just below one of the tray tables, retrieving a children's kitty cup and a small bottle of orange syrupy liquid. "This is the anesthetic," she said. handing it to Gaster for inspection. "Papyrus, when you drink all of this, you will fall asleep in just a few moments. You won't wake up for a couple of hours. When you do, you'll be tired and you won't be able to move around very well. Understand?" 2 nodded. Yes. Gaster dutifully examined the concoction, holding it up to the light, swirling it around, turning it every which way in search of a flaw. He knew there wouldn't be. He had mixed it himself, after all. But those 2 didn't need to know that. He handed the bottle back to Alphys with a nod. She twisted it open and poured the contents into the kitty cup. "Okay, put your legs out in front of you," Alphys said. He uncrossed his legs, which were so long his feet nearly hung off the edge of the gurney. "Here you go. Don't stop until all of it's gone. Sans, would you mind hopping down so he has room to lie back?" 2 took the drink from Alphys, and his brother gave his hand one last squeeze before jumping to the floor. It was then that Gaster saw the red scarf on 2 again.
"That's going to have to go,"
he said abruptly. Everyone in the room looked at him. What was that?" Alphys asked.
"The scarf.
2 touched it and looked back at him, puzzled.
It's a hazard. If we have to move him quickly, it may strangle him."
"Oh, right, of course," Alphys said. "Papyrus, would you mind taking it off? We'll give it back to you afterward, I promise." He ran a hand over it possessively before handing it to his brother. Gaster watched one ball it up in his arms as tightly as he could, but the end of it still trailed on the floor. One gave him a look, and Gaster quickly returned his gaze to 2. 2 took a deep breath, then clamped the straw between his teeth and rapidly gulped the contents. When air was heard rushing through the straw, he unlatched with a gasp and made a disgusted face. "Ah, it's terrible! It's so sweet!" Alphys laughed, then after glancing at Gaster turned it into a more professional chortle. "We, did add some extra flavoring to try to make it taste better." Gaster frowned. By we, Alphys meant him. He had spent hours reviewing every chemical and compound in the anesthetic, running them against all the chemicals and compounds in the sugary drink mix, to be sure they wouldn't react with one another. If 2 didn't like it, then his brother could have none in his dose. Alphys took 2 by an arm and gestured for 1 to do the same. He struggled to help his brother lie back and to hold the scarf at the same time, so Asgore stepped up and took it off his hands. Alphys asked, "Papyrus, I need you to count back from 100 for me, okay?" 2 opened and closed his jaw, as though airing out his mouth would dispel the flavor. "Ah, it's far too sweet. I can still feel it on my teeth." "Maybe this means you'll have sweet dreams, eh, bro?" one quipped. "Brother, you aren't helping." "Heh, if you say so. How about you count like the doc said? That might help." Alphys and 1 had him flat on his back now. "Fine. 1, 2. She said count back from 100. "I know what she said, but I'm not going to. That's a stupid way to count." He was beginning to slur, and his eyelights wavered. "Doc's orders, bro." "Oh, very well. 100. And with that he went still, jaw still parted in protest. "Sans, could you please stand with King Asgore?" Alphys asked. "We need to make room for Dr. Gaster." 1 turned defensive. "I thought you said I could stay with him." "You can, but Dr. Gaster and I need room to work. You'll still be able to see everything, I promise." He looked at Gaster, and his eye sockets went dark for a moment. Then he shrugged and walked over to the king. One's uncanny ability to shift from combative to reticent was troubling, but that was not Gaster's chief concern at the moment. "Vitals look good," Alphys said. "Ready when you are, Dr. Gaster." Gaster picked a hand screwdriver off the surgical tray. Alphys took the plated hand and carefully turned it over, moving it into position for Gaster. I can't see, Gaster heard to his left. Asgore muttered something, and there was a rustle of fabric and a grunt. Gaster peered over and saw one perched on the king's shoulder like some dour, flightless bird. He held himself steady by gripping one of Asgore's horns. Gaster rolled his eye, then got to work. His hand joined Alphys's in holding the plated hands steady. He fitted the screwdriver into the head of the first screw on the first metacarpal. He twisted and met quite a bit of resistance. Gaster applied firm but careful pressure, avoiding the glare of his own initials staring back at him from the cold steel. There was a creaking sound, like a green twig being bent to its limits. Finally it gave and Gaster grunted, causing everyone but his patient to jump. He worked the screw out very slowly, allowing it to guide itself up the natural path threaded into the bone. Each twist brought a dry, grinding sound, which he allowed to fill his entire world. Gaster couldn't see how the extraction was going beneath the plate. The resistance of the tool in his hand and the sound of metal on bone were all he had to go by. This was the larger metacarpal, but it was only 6 or 7 millimeters thick, and the screw was even shorter than that. But it was thick and sturdy. It had to be in order to remain secure as the bone grew and shifted around it. Long after Gaster had stopped counting the turns, the resistance was gone and the screw came free. He plucked it out of the hole, set it into a tray beside him with a soft plink, then moved to the next one. This one was much the same as the first. A difficult start, then slow and meticulous work all the way to the end. The bone held together nicely as the second screw came loose. Before continuing, he gestured to Alphys to move her hand so that he could examine his work. He lifted the hand toward the light, vaguely noting the twin piles of bone dust left on the table. The finger swung freely below the plate, giving him an unobstructed view of the holes from the top.
Looks good,
he said, signing with his magic hands in front of him.
They came out cleanly. I see no additional cracking or breakage.
Alphys nodded. Can you see any damage or wear to the joints that would affect his range of motion?
It's difficult to say. That's something he'll have to tell us as he's recovering.
Gaster heard one shift.
If you're ready, let us move on to the next.
Clinical silence filled the room again as he and Alphys moved to take on the 5th metacarpal. This one should have been a bit easier, now that the plate had only 2 contact points. He applied as much pressure as he dared, listening to the small creaks and pops, acutely aware of how fragile this bone was. At last it popped loose, and Gaster breathed again. He heard a sigh of relief beside him and nearly started, having forgotten in the moment that they had onlookers. He clenched his jaw and continued. As the tool turned, Gaster heard more scraping and cracking than before, and slowed his turning to a crawl. This one would probably come out with a bit of damage. When it was gone, he stopped to examine the hand again. The plate swung freely around the last point of contact, and Gaster had to move it out of his way to see. He saw several distinct cracks around the hole in the bone, with some areas threatening to come loose altogether. Alphys leaned forward to see. Would healing him now help? She asked.
No, this was inevitable. It's had no effect on his HP, see? We'll seal it up with the resin at the end.
What's going on? Came one's voice. The king shushed the child, and they had a muttered argument as Gaster and Alphys prepared to remove the final screw. Gaster gripped the plate around the edges while Alphys held the wrist and phalanges in place. He braced the hand and twisted, and the whole thing came loose with a crumbling snap. Alphys tensed, but didn't move an inch.
Alphys, keep holding while I lift the plate. When it's clear, we will assess the damage.
Damage? What's happening? Let me see.
No sense. Stay back. Let them work,
Asgore warned. As Gaster gingerly lifted the plate away from the hand, he heard a small tussle.
If you don't stop, you will have to wait outside.
Let me go! Asgore grunted, and from the edge of his vision, Gaster saw one jump off of the king toward the table. "Sans, no!" Alphys cried, but the child never landed. He was suspended in the air by blue magic, soul glowing faintly through his hoodie. That same moment, the damage under the plate was revealed. The top half of the metacarpal had fallen to pieces. The hole had lost all structure, breaking into multiple fragments. The other phalanges, having lost their connection to the wrist, lay detached and inert on the table. One gasped. You ruined his hand. How could you? He trusted you!" Without looking up, Gaster sent him drifting back toward the king.
Asgore, take him out of here.
He signed. "Stop it! Let me see him!" one shouted, kicking and clawing against the blue magic. He bumped into Asgore's chest, who gently put an arm around him. Gaster let him go, but one continued to carry on. "No, let go of me! Let me see my brother! Let me see him!" Asgore muttered placating things as he carried the boy out of the room. When the door shut behind them, Gaster looked at Alphys. She was pale and trembling, but her hands gripping the patient were steady. Gaster turned his magic hands to face her.
This is not salvageable. The metacarpal is damaged beyond repair. The best we can do is remove the fragments so that he can use the rest of his hand without trouble.
Alphys licked her lips and nodded. "In order to prevent spontaneous reattachment, won't we have to—"
Yes, the bone will have to be destroyed.
Alphys turned even paler, but nodded again. He looked her in the eye.
I'll need you to heal him. It will bring his overall HP down slightly, but this will be much less painful in the end. Are you ready?
Alphys removed her hand from the phalanges and placed them both on the wrist, steeling herself. "Yes." Gaster summoned a small bone with his magic, pointing it at the shattered metacarpal. Attack magic was not at all a common tool for surgery, but seeing as he had no hammer or other large blunt instrument, he'd have to make do.
On 3,
he said.
1, 2, 3.
The attack pierced the center of the bone fragment, breaking it with a sharp snap. A warning sounded from the HP monitor, and Alphys's hands lit up with green healing magic as the severed pieces dissolved into a fine powder. Even the 3 detached phalanges turned to dust. After a moment, the monitor's warning subsided, and the glow around Alphys's hands faded. Gaster nodded his approval.
Good work. Now let's seal the other holes with the resin.
The procedure was simple from that point on. They took care to clean all the excess resin from around the 2 holes, so the seal was as seamless as possible. The bone was not wrapped, as the resin needed air to set properly. After unplugging him from the monitoring equipment, Gaster used his blue magic to move the child to a cot they'd set up across the room. He then assisted Alphys in cleaning up, placing the screwdrivers and the tools they'd used to mix the resin in a bin to be cleaned. Last, they gathered and disposed of the screws, plate, and dust. As they finished, Gaster caught Alphys staring at the plate. When she saw him looking, she jumped and stuffed it into the waste bag. "Sorry, it's just they told me you could, well..." Gaster nodded slowly.
Yes, it has a trace amount of magic that I could use to track their location.
She swallowed hard, not meeting his eye. I see, yes." Unbidden, the sound of snapping bone filled his mind. Then the scream. His fists clenched. I'll go get Sans, and then explain to Papyrus when that...
No.
Gaster blurted. He signed,
No, I will explain what happened.
Alphys gave him a pained look. "Doctor, it's not your fault. You don't need to..."
Yes, it is my fault, and I will tell him.
She wrung her hands together, uncomfortable. Okay, But either Asgore or I will have to...
Yes, I know.
The next hour was one of the longest and most uncomfortable Gaster had ever experienced in his life. Asgore and One returned after Alphys left, and the three of them took up positions around the cot where Two rested. One gave Gaster a poisonous look before he hopped onto the cot, clutching his brother's uninjured hand in his. Gaster leaned against the nearest wall, hands jammed in his pockets, fiddling with the lighter and box of cigarettes he'd stashed in them. Asgore sat in a chair he pulled up right between the three skeletons. The king split his time between looking at the boys, looking at Gaster, and plucking the absurdly small crown off of his head to rub at imaginary smudges. He was clearly trying his hardest to not look like he was guarding the children from the scientist. Gaster looked directly at the two on the cot as little as his professional obligation allowed. He did note the scarf had reappeared. The red lump was perched atop Two's chest. God, he needed a cigarette so badly he was shaking. He thought about excusing himself for a few minutes, but no, that wouldn't do. He had never left them alone while they were unconscious like this, and he wouldn't start now. After a while, Gaster realized One had fallen asleep next to his brother. All the better. When Asgore noticed as well, he stood to go lean against the wall with Gaster.
Good work today,
He said quietly.
We'll see.
Gaster signed.
Don't be so hard on yourself. You did everything you could.
Asgore said.
How much longer till he wakes, do you think?
30 minutes, maybe. It's hard to say. He's never been one to sleep much, though.
Asgore smiled faintly.
Not like his brother, I see.
Gaster said nothing.
Papyrus asks about you a lot.
Asgore said after a few minutes.
He wants to know what you do, where you came from, if there are any others like you.
Gaster shifted uncomfortably.
What have you told him?
I said, you work to make life here in the underground better, and that there were many skeletons long ago, but after the war...
He trailed off.
They don't quite understand the war. Well, I think Sans might, but Papyrus seems resistant to the idea of that much conflict.
Gaster huffed.
Sounds about right.
He eyed the scarf on Two's chest, hoping his friend hadn't shown them any pictures from back then, too. God, that was the last thing they needed to see. Asgore scratched the back of his head.
You know, I haven't told them they can't ever see you. After a bit more time, I could mention that if they wanted...
Absolutely not.
Asgore frowned.
I'm not going to deny them access to the only other one of their kind.
He turned to face Gaster directly.
Do you not see how important this is for them? There is so much for you to pass on to them. If you would only just...
Dr. Elphys is handling their education perfectly well. If they have any further questions, she can consult me.
Gaster...
No. I know what you're asking for, Asgore, and I will not do it. You want me to be some sort of...
Gaster cut himself off, then glared at his friend. He finished with 2 clipped signs.
No. Never.
Asgore looked displeased. They fell back into silence. One still appeared to be asleep, despite their argument. The words Asgore said a few days ago came floating back into Gaster's mind. You don't get to decide when you're forgiven. Well, nothing to worry about with that one. And that's not why he was here anyway. More time passed this way, and finally Papyrus began to stir. Gaster straightened and approached the cot, with Asgore 1 step behind him. One had woken up as well and bristled at their presence, but his eyes never left his brother. "Bro, you awake? Can you hear me?" he asked. Papyrus groaned and muttered something incoherent. "Bro, I'm here. Come on, wake up."
Be patient,
Gaster said.
It will take a few minutes for him to fully wake.
One gave him a nasty look, but then Papyrus said in a scratchy voice, Where am I? What's happening? Why does my hand hurt?
Papyrus, you just finished surgery. Do you remember?
Surgery? His eyelights flickered. Oh, why is my brother here? Are we back in the cell? Gaster blanched, and one gently shook his brother's shoulder. No, bro, we're in the castle. We're home, remember? Yes, that's right. Pure and honest relief spread across his face. He placed his hands on top of the scarf, then pulling it close, almost drifted off again. In a minute, his eyelights flickered and stayed on, however faintly. Hello, brother. What are you doing here? One smiled and stroked his brother's head. I'm here 'cause you're here. We got your plate taken off, remember? Plate? Oh, is that why it hurts? Papyrus brought his right hand directly in front of his face, squinting hard at the appendage. Wowee, it's off. And it feels so light? He turned his hand every which way, wearing the stupidest grin on his face. He flexed his fingers together and apart, seeming to delight in the simple act of moving them horizontally. After a moment, he paused and squinted again. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4... One stiffened. Bro, there's something I gotta tell you. I appear to be short one finger, Papyrus said flatly. Everyone went still. Did something go wrong with the surgery? One tried to begin, but Gaster cleared his figurative throat.
Yes. Unfortunately, your fifth metacarpal degraded beyond repair. It had to be removed, as well as the other phalanges attached to it.
Oh. Papyrus slowly rotated his hand, examining the empty space. Then he sighed. Well, that's too bad. Gaster blinked at the rather blasé reply. He had expected a bit more of a reaction from the news of permanent disfigurement. One broke in now. You're gonna be okay, bro. Doc says you're gonna be able to use all your other fingers just fine, and it'll stop hurting soon. Of course I'm going to be okay. What is one missing finger to your brother Papyrus? He put his left arm around his brother, pulling him into an awkward side hug. And if that's the worst that can happen, you'll do just fine when they take yours off. Asgore chuckled and shook his head.
Young one, your spirit never ceases to amaze me.
Papyrus puffed up from the praise, then turned to beam at Gaster. Thank you so much! I knew you could do it, I'm so happy! Gaster averted his gaze, looking intently at the scarf instead. His soul felt like it was twisting into knots.
There's no need to thank me.
Panic and screaming he could have handled. But this... I knew you could be good if you just tried! Gaster felt his eyes were dangerously close to glowing, and what color he didn't know. He took a deep breath, then let it out slowly.
How does your hand feel?
Papyrus flexed his fingers again. It hurts a bit, and it feels warm? Gaster nodded.
That's the resin setting. It will cool with a bit more time, and the pain should subside as well. We will have some more medicine for you if it hurts too much.
No, it's fine, I think, Papyrus said. And you'll do my brother tomorrow?
Yes, as long as your condition doesn't change.
He giggled, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. Oh, isn't it wonderful, brother? Yeah, I'm stoked, one chuckled dryly. But seriously, are you okay? Papyrus cupped his brother's face in a hand. Yes, and you'll be okay too, I promise. One put his hand on top of his brother's. If you say so. Asgore put a paw on Gaster's back, startling him.
Dr. Gaster, I think we have things under control here. If you have no further questions, You can go rest now.
Gaster nodded.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
As he walked away, Papyrus called after him. "We'll see you tomorrow then, Dr. Gaster." Gaster kept on walking. He could not get to the courtyard for that cigarette fast enough. The next morning, Papyrus felt fine, and so that afternoon they met at the same time for his brother's surgery. It was a much less dramatic affair than the first procedure, overall. The snide comments stopped after one drank the anesthetic, the flavor of which was much more to his taste. Papyrus proved to be a much more cooperative, and more importantly silent, observer. He stood in front of the king, who put his paws on Papyrus's shoulders and whispered bracing things as it went. Along with Gaster going much slower to minimize the damage, Alphys provided a small but constant stream of healing magic as they went. Even the slightest drop in one's HP could not be risked. However, while Alphys was much more capable of healing than Gaster or even Asgore, magic was not her forte. She was already breathing heavily after the first screw was removed, and halfway through the third, the healing glow wavered.
Stop.
Gaster signed.
You're exhausted. We can wait a moment.
Alphys shook her head and rasped. "No, I can do this. We're so close."
There's no point in going on if you're going to burn out before we finish.
"I can heal him." Both of them turned to look at Papyrus. His face was set with determined seriousness, framed by the scarf in such a way that gave Gaster pause. "I can heal him. You know I can. Please, let me do it." Gaster considered him. Alphys would go until she collapsed if he asked her to, but ultimately that would not help anyone. Gaster nodded and beckoned him forward. Papyrus put his hands on top of Alphys's. His four-fingered right hand landed on top, and Gaster's eye lingered on it. Papyrus's hands came alight with healing magic. Then Alphys removed her hands and stepped out of the way.
Now, not too much,
Gaster said, not bothering with sign language for the moment.
Just a trickle. This'll take some time.
The glow dimmed.
There. Now, hold it. Right there.
Gaster had to admit, not only was Papyrus's magic strong, but his stamina and control were excellent. He had a fleeting thought that it was too bad he hadn't gotten a chance to test those abilities. He squelched the thought immediately. That was in the past. Focus on the present. The final screw came loose, and Gaster pulled the plate free, revealing 4 small and perfectly round holes. Their edges were pristine. No additional breakage had occurred. He nodded to Papyrus.
Good. Now let Dr. Alphys back in, and we will seal the holes.
Papyrus beamed, and it took all of Gaster's will to not glower at him. The child did as he was told and backed up. Alphys had already mixed the resin, so without delay they set about to cleaning and sealing the holes. When they finished, Gaster gave the bones a final once-over before calling it done. Only then did Papyrus let out an elated whoop. The king laughed, patting him on the back and congratulating him on a job well done. Even Alphys, tired as she was, couldn't seem to dispel the huge grin that spread across her face. Gaster had fully intended on letting Alphys take over the post-op watch this time, but after watching her barely muddle through cleanup, he sent her straight home. Once again, it was he, Asgore, and the children all stuck in a room together. Except this time, the conscious child wanted to talk. After giving several monosyllable answers to Papyrus's inquiries, Gaster explained as civilly as he could that he was tired and not feeling up to small talk just now. The child looked a bit put out, and so Asgore stepped in to indulge his ceaseless gabbing. One remained asleep a full 90 minutes longer than his brother had. Gaster was not at all surprised by this. Asgore and Papyrus were so busy chatting and playing games, mostly puzzles, they hardly seemed to notice. However, when his brother finally did stir, Papyrus was the first to know. "Brother!" he called, launching himself at the cot in a streak of red fabric before Asgore or Gaster even knew what happened. "Brother, are you awake? It went well! Everything is fine. Can you hear me?"
Papyrus, calm down. Let the boy breathe.
Asgore admonished. When Gaster approached the cot, the view was much the same as before, except the roles were reversed. Papyrus sat on the side and was shaking his brother insistently. Soon one's large eye sockets flickered with light.
Bro? What's up?
"Brother, you're awake!"
That seems to be the case.
"Yes, it is! And I have great news! Everything went splendidly!"
What did?
"Your plate removal, of course. It came off perfectly, just like I said it would. All of your fingers are fine."
Oh, yeah.
One lifted his hand and held it in front of his face, trying to focus on the bones.
Guess I'm gonna have to take your word on it. Man, I'm tired.
His eyelights flickered out, and Papyrus shook him again. "Brother, what's the matter? Can you not see?" He looked to Gaster, his face all concern.
This is normal.
Gaster reassured him.
He'll be groggy for some time, and may have trouble seeing and hearing until the medicine works its way out of his system.
"Oh." Papyrus considered this for a moment. "Will you stay until he wakes up?" Gaster sighed.
I will stay until he can remain conscious long enough to tell me if anything is wrong.
A snort came from below them.
Well, if that's the case, I guess I'm ready to get up.
"Brother!" Papyrus put his hands on his hips. "You were pretending to sleep?"
How was I supposed to know he'd stick around? He split as soon as you woke up yesterday.
"That's not..."
How are you feeling?
Gaster spoke very loudly to cut Papyrus off. He was not in the mood for brotherly banter right now. One gestured with his hands rather dramatically as he spoke.
Oh, not too bad. Feels like somebody drilled a big old plate into my hand and then pulled it back off, but otherwise it's fine. Funny how that works, huh, G?
Gaster crossed his arms.
Hilarious. Can you move it well enough?
One opened and closed his hand, then made a few waves with his fingers.
Yeah, works fine. Guess you had enough fingers for your collection, huh? Didn't need to pop any of mine off, too?
Asgore spoke up.
Sans, that's enough. Answer Dr. Gaster's questions, please, and no more.
The child groaned.
Fine. Feels kinda sore. No, I don't want medicine for it. Also feels kinda warm, but that's just the resin setting, I know.
He rose a brow at Gaster.
Anything else?
No. If anything changes, let Dr. Alphys or the king know immediately.
So they can run to you and ask how to fix me, huh?
If that's what it takes to keep you alive, then so be it.
Gaster snapped. The words were out before he fully realized what he'd said. The effect was immediate. Sans drew back and his face went blank, and Papyrus's eyes lit up with something that made Gaster desperately want to be somewhere else. Asgore simply looked perplexed. Gaster sighed heavily and ran a hand down his face.
Your Majesty, I believe I've seen enough. I'll be going now.
He strode out of the room without waiting to be dismissed. He was going to head straight home and not emerge again until the next human fell. Gaster sat on the floor of his office in the core facility, trying to make sense of some odd readings. Reports, graphs, and calculations were spread out in front of him on a short coffee table. The anomaly was becoming a larger problem than he and the core team had originally estimated, but he believed if they acted quickly they could prevent it from becoming critical. The tremors were still worsening, though, and construction on some handrails throughout the facility had begun, per Asgore's request. There was a knock at the door.
Come in,
He called. As soon as he said the words, he remembered they wouldn't be understood by the person on the other side. He sighed and stood to answer it. Before he could even cross the room, the door swung inward. Gaster froze. In his doorway stood Papyrus and Sans, alone. The former was wearing a striped sweater, the red scarf, and held a squat basket in his arms. His baggy pants were stuffed into a pair of enormous brown boots. The latter wore sweatpants which were so long they covered his shoes, and a hoodie whose front pockets he'd jammed his hands into. Sans also wore a scowl, where his brother had on a nervous grin. Gaster did nothing but gape at them for several moments. Papyrus broke the silence with a small cough. Hello, he stammered, waving a four-fingered greeting. We brought a gift for you. His arms flew out to present the basket, which trembled slightly in his grip. A salty and pungent smell wafted into the room. Gaster looked at the basket, then back at Papyrus.
Are you two supposed to be here?
King Asgore said we could explore the castle.
This isn't the castle.
Here, we made these for you. The castle, chef, has been teaching us how to cook. Gaster was too dumbfounded to engage further. The nerve of them! They'd probably talked to every monster from the castle to the core to find him here. He had half a mind to drag them by their souls straight back to Asgore, if only that didn't mean he'd have to explain what had happened. Sans rolled his eyes. Well, you gonna take 'em or not? Hardly knowing why, Gaster approached them and snatched up the basket. Papyrus flinched, and he remembered he was wearing his lab coat. That explained the agitation. Well, served him right. Gaster opened the cloth covering the top, revealing what might have been pastries in the loosest of terms. Brownish lumps of various sizes, a few leaking some kind of red filling. Gaster brought them closer to his face for further inspection, and was immediately struck with the unmistakable odor of garlic and marinara. Papyrus bounced with giddiness. It's garlic! I love garlic and tomatoes! I thought you'd like them too, so I put them into some bread since they're hard to eat on their own. Gaster had never had so much difficulty finding something to say in his life. It wasn't even that he couldn't find the right words, it was that he couldn't find any at all. Unable to bear the smell any longer, he turned and walked the basket over to the table, setting it by his coffee mug. Papyrus's grin wavered a little. Don't you want to try one? Finally, a proper question he could answer.
No, not right now. I prefer not to eat in my office.
You're having that, Sans interjected, eyeing the coffee mug.
That's different.
How?
It's liquid.
Well, how about you come outside of your office? Then you won't be eating inside.
No.
Papyrus flinched again. Gaster closed his eye and rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers.
Was there anything else you wanted? I have to get back to work.
He could almost hear the glance the brothers exchanged. Then Papyrus spoke. Well, I wanted to know if you wanted my scarf, too. Gaster's eyes snapped open. The child was wringing the tail end of it nervously in his hands. You spend a lot of time looking at it. I was wondering if that's because you liked it? You can have it if you want. Dr. Alphys and the King gave us lots of clothes. I'm sure I can find another just as great. Gaster was trembling. This had to stop. It was absolutely too much. Part of him wanted to say yes just so he could burn the wretched thing and forget it. Having those 2 running all over the underground was bad enough, but having one running around looking like a clone of... Never in his life had Gaster wanted to smack himself so badly.
No, thank you. Keep it,
he said tightly.
Now, if you don't mind, I have some very critical
There was a rustle of papers behind him. He turned around to see Sans rifling through the calculations he'd been working on. So you're trying to find X and Z without letting F get to 66, right? Looks like it'd be a lot easier if you just...
Out!
Gaster took 2 quick strides around the table, but the child dropped the papers and immediately returned to his brother's side. If you just let F be 66, that'd solve the problem a lot easier, G, Sans said, smirking. Gaster narrowed his eye at him.
If F reaches 66, then the core will implode and we will all die.
The smirk slipped a little.
Now go. I have a lot of important work to do, and I don't need distractions.
Papyrus looked a bit crestfallen, but tried to keep it off his face as he backed up into the hall.
Oh, okay. Well, tell me if you like them. I can make you some more anytime, or something else if you'd prefer, and just tell me if you ever change your mind about...
He was cut off as Sans shut the door a little harder than necessary. Gaster leaned against his desk and put a hand over his face, letting out a sigh that ended in a groan. He stood that way for several moments, trying to process what had just happened. It was as if Papyrus only existed to pester him with nonsense. He should have told them to leave the moment he took the basket. No, he shouldn't have taken the basket at all. He looked at the offending thing again, taking a peek at the little abominations one last time. Where on earth had he gotten such an idea? And what had possessed him to think it was a good one? Some things never changed, it seemed. At least if he was baking, that meant his hand wasn't bothering him too much. Gaster returned to where he'd been sitting on the floor, moving the papers back to where they'd been before the other had gone snooping. Come to think of it, Sans hadn't actually been wrong, per se. He only lacked all the necessary information to come to the right conclusion. Sans was clever, and no matter how much Gaster tried, he couldn't help but see a little of himself at that age in him. Extremely bright, insatiably curious, a little taciturn, and more than a little cheeky. With proper guidance, he could become one of the most brilliant minds in the underground, given it didn't eat him up inside. His gaze dropped to his hands as he thought. Gaster would never dream of being on good terms with them, nor would he ever dream of being forgiven, though the king's words still haunted him.
Well, Asgore,
He thought dryly.
is this what forgiveness looks like? Garlic pastries and a scarf.
Reaching into his coat pockets, Gaster pulled out his cigarettes and lighter. He didn't usually smoke in his office, but he needed to get his mind off of this, or at the very least, offset the smell of his gift. After savoring the first few drags, he forced his thoughts to return to Sans. His talent was so raw, and his potential so great. He could have his pick of any position in the science division one day. Not that he'd ever join while Gaster was there. That alone could steer him away from the field altogether. Not to mention the underground's desperate lack of advanced educational resources. His eye drifted to the bookshelf by his desk. Well, that was one thing that could be fixed. A box had arrived with their breakfast. Sans and Papyrus tore into it immediately, ignoring the spread of fresh pastries and hot tea to open the unlabeled gift. Papyrus had broke the seal first, discovering a trove of books inside which he eagerly sorted through. His enthusiasm waned as he tried and failed to understand the titles of the thick, dull books. Calculus, Geometry, Atoms and molecules? Papyrus said. What do all of these ridiculous words mean? Sans, on the contrary, only became more interested in what he saw. He picked each volume up as Papyrus set them down. They're about math, bro, he said. And chemistry.
Where did they come from? Did the chef send them here?
Nah, doubt it.
Then who?
Papyrus turned around to see Sans carefully scrutinizing each book. When Sans noticed his brother staring, he shrugged.
Dunno.
Papyrus sighed dramatically. Well, we can look at them more after breakfast.
Yeah, be there in a sec, bro,
Sans replied, not looking up from the calculus book he'd just cracked open. Sometime later, Dr. Alphys came by. Sans was lying on the floor, buried deep in an astronomy book and absently gnawing on a cold piece of toast. Papyrus was picking up crumbs scattered around his brother's immediate area. The sight of Sans so engaged brought a smile to Alphys's face. I see you found the king's gift, she said. Was it the king who sent the books? Papyrus asked, continuing to clean directly under his oblivious brother. Yes, he found out how interested Sans was in math and, science, so he had these books pulled from the castle library for him. Sans didn't respond, his eyes locked onto a map of the stars. So, I take it you like them? Papyrus frowned and nudged his brother with his foot, nearly rolling him over on his side. Brother, Dr. Alphys asked you a question.
Yeah, I heard,
Sans muttered. At last he made eye contact with Alphys over the top of the book.
You said they came from the king, huh?
The king's library, yes. I helped pick them out, though. Sans scrutinized Alphys, watching her fret and grin uncomfortably. Then, after a moment, his expression lightened and his smile appeared almost genuine.
Yeah, they're pretty good. Tell him I say thanks next time you see him.
Yes, tell him thank you for me as well. But maybe add next time that some storybooks would be nice. These are a bit, how to put it, lacking in prose. Alphys giggled nervously. Yes, I'll pass word along to him. The one about the silly piggy was decent, but his rabbit friend really stole the show, in my opinion. Would there be more on that character? I'll certainly ask him to look. Please do. And Sans really liked the one about the tortoise and the hare. However, he seemed to like the tortoise, even though the hare was clearly the star. Do you think there are more stories about the tortoise for him? Papyrus and Alphys went back and forth on the subject for some time. Sans put down the astronomy book and spotted a rather thick title labeled Quantum Physics. As he picked it up, the weight seemed strangely distributed. He opened the cover to reveal a rectangular hole carved into the pages of the book, creating a hidden opening. Inlaid was a small notebook. It was very old and faded, the writing on the cover hard to decipher. Sans carefully picked the leather-bound volume out and held it close to his face. At last he recognized the strange symbols on the cover, and his eyelights went dark for a moment. Sans peeked at Alphys and Papyrus to make sure they weren't looking, then carefully thumbed through the book. Well, no surprise here. Did he really think Sans wouldn't figure it out? Was this a sick joke? The old coot probably hadn't even bothered filling the gaps in his bookshelf. After skimming several pages, Sans realized it was a sort of joke and riddle book, all completely handwritten. He tilted his head in confusion. Maybe it was a kind of sick joke. All the rest of it seemed to be. The greatest one being that sadist up there in his office, drinking coffee and making life in the underground better. It was a battle Sans was losing hope in winning. What he called injustice, Papyrus called mercy. Everything his brother had seen since they'd gotten out only further convinced him that mercy was always the solution. Sans, on the other hand, had learned that justice was selective. He loved and admired his brother more than anything, and he wanted to be strong and protect him. But every time he tried and failed. Dr. Alphys and the king had done a lot for them, and Sans couldn't just write all that off. However, their refusal to pick a side when it came to what that freak had done to them was frustrating. And unlike Papyrus, it wasn't because they thought that mercy was the best option. They were simply too afraid to act. All of it just made him tired. So very tired. Sans shut the joke book and placed it back inside the quantum physics book. He looked back over at Papyrus. He was regaling some story they'd read to Dr. Alphys, and seemed much more invested in the telling than she was. Sans smiled. He would never be as cheerful or as brave as Papyrus, but he could watch from a distance, basking in the light that shone from him. A moon to his brother's sun, a satellite to watch over him. Dr. Alphys backed away from Papyrus as he continued to gesticulate wildly, until she was close enough to speak with Sans. "If you want any other books like these, I'd be happy to find some for you," she whispered. Even though Sans knew who exactly would be finding those books, that didn't really sound so bad to him now. His arguing and fighting for justice had been thwarted. Knowledge was really the only weapon left to him now. It was the only thing Gaster had never been able to take away from them. Sans chuckled. "Thanks, Doc. I think I'm covered for now, but I'll send you a page if I think of something."